Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Sniper Elite 3 for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Xbox One, and PS4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a stealth action game developed by Rebellion that was released in July of 2014, and it's actually a prequel to Sniper Elite V2, meaning that the numbering here is starting to get rather confusing, but that's beside the point. What is, however, the point is the changes that were made between V2 and Sniper Elite 3. Because Sniper Elite V2 had some pretty good stuff going on with it, but at the same time, it also featured numerous problems. And thus, ultimately, the question becomes, did Rebellion learn from their mistakes with V2 and correct them in 3, or did something else happen entirely? Let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Now, as far as presentation goes, it is undoubtedly superior to V2. Not only are the visuals themselves better, because they've got better modeling, better texture work, better animations, with the environments themselves being just as detailed as the previous game, you find that they have introduced a fair bit of color in this game as well. That's not to say that they completely did away with the brown and gray that we saw just permeating every facet of V2, but they added in more color and they made everything generally brighter as well, which makes it a hell of a lot more appealing. So while I could praise the visual quality in V2, in this I can both praise the visual quality and the aesthetic, which they've done a very good job with. What they've also done a good job with is making sure that the X-ray kill cam is back and basically better than ever. It is still gory as hell, it still shows the various organs and bones being eviscerated and shattered, and like in the previous game, that is very satisfying the first several times you do it, and then afterwards it just kind of loses its luster. Now, they do try to spice things up by throwing in quite a few vehicles that you can shoot the weak spots of to send erupting into a massive fireball, but that doesn't really help out the kill cam all that much in the long run, and it just ends up becoming something that starts off as, hey, this is actually really cool, and goes to, whatever. Then you move over into sound design, and that's where things start to get a bit messier. The voice acting is what I would describe as bland. The protagonist just has the grizzled veteran monotone going on, and he ends up getting rather boring rather quickly, and none of the other characters really pick up the slack either. And when you move over into the non-English stuff, the German speakers in this enunciate way too much, and they end up sounding like they're students more than they're actual speakers of German. But hey, they're actually speaking German, so I gotta give them credit for that. And then, of course, there's the Italians, who actually speak Italian as well, though I'm not really that well versed in Italian, so I can't really comment too much on their performance. It's just that it's nice to see them included, because a lot of people just forget that the Italians even fought in the North African campaign, let alone in World War II at all. Moving on into the other aspects of the sound design, the music is what I would describe as generic war movie music. It works for what it is, but it's nothing particularly interesting, and it ends up just fading into the background. You barely even notice it most of the time. And of course there's the sound effects, which can get a bit messy, particularly with directional sound, because you'll hear a sound that you think might cover your shots, but it turns out you're mistaken and you're just hearing it because the sound mixing is such that certain sounds are just going to be louder than others, whether they're supposed to be or not. That's not to say that the sound is bad, it's just that the mixing is such that it makes the sound masking technique that you have to use for your shots a bit messy. In fact, most of the sound effects are fairly decent. I mean, the rifles don't sound particularly great, but the explosions do, and the sounds of eviscerating your opponents when you go into the X-ray kill cam and everything are kind of grisly and satisfying. But the ambient noise is really the problem there, because certain sounds are rather loud in the environment and you would think that you'd be able to cover your shots with them, but it turns out you can't. But apart from those particular sounds, the rest of the ambient noise is rather well done. It's just a shame that it does become an issue. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this I would describe as pure fantasy, because it centers around a particular German Wunderwaffe project that never even left the planning stages, but they're saying it gets into not only prototype, but actual prototype production. And you're thrown into the boots of OSS sniper Karl Fairburn, like you were in the previous game, V2, as he goes and tries to stop that particular project from even remotely being a thing. It takes a pretty ridiculous number of liberties, and it's pretty obvious that you're really not supposed to be taking the story all that seriously as you go through the game. Which is definitely a good thing because it draws focus off of the fact that the story is very, very bare bones. They do try to tie it into the larger war here and there, but they do a pretty poor job of that, and what you end up with is just a story that follows this one lone ultra badass sniper as he tries to take down some rogue Nazi general and his super project. Which ultimately means that it really does fall to the gameplay to bring things up, and luckily they have definitely made some improvements over the previous game in the series. The first major improvement they made is that they made the game considerably less linear. You do have a series of objectives that you do need to complete, but the game gives you some leeway in actually being able to complete them. You're given run of the level to basically just go in and say, okay, I want to set this up here, and I want to set this up there, I want to lay these traps down here, and I'm going to let all this go into a chain of motion. The rather cramped corridor-like levels of V2 really aren't much of a thing anymore, and that is greatly appreciated. That's not to say that the game doesn't railroad you at all, because it does railroad you at several points, and some of them are actually very, very annoying. Like one particular segment where the game forces you to sit there and wait for a guy to grab a particular bit of intel, and then you can go and take him out. And it does this by making it an instant fail if you take out one of 3 of the enemy officers before the guy gets his intel, or if you get spotted before the guy gets his intel, or if you take too long to tag the guy, and it's just a mess, and that particular bit of the game was downright irritating. Because up until that point, the game is basically emphasizing that yes, you're supposed to be stealthy, but you can get through shooting if you need to. And it encourages a more open-ended style of play where you're supposed to say, okay, I see my various opportunities for cover and advancement and sneaking along here and there and taking this guy out quietly and so on and so forth, and then in this it's just like, nah, you had to wait because we say so. But what gets more irritating than that is when you have to deal with tanks or other vehicles, because you have to shoot the weak spots on them and it can take several shots to bring them down. Thing is that they can instantly spot you when you hit them, or if you lay down a landmine, for example, they'll instantly know where you are, because that makes sense. Now when it's just one of those vehicles you have to deal with, it's not as much of a problem, but then there's the one particular level that throws 3 of them at you at once, and then you have to prioritize which one you're going to take out first. The thing is, being able to take them out by actually shooting their weak spots is pretty damn cool. It's just that the way you end up having to fight them, where they just somehow instantly know where you are, ends up being incredibly irritating. Now, of course, part of this is the problematic AI, which ranges from unbelievably stupid to magically accurate. There really isn't much in between there, and unfortunately, while they did improve the stealth itself by giving you a bit more options there, the lack of improvement to the AI ends up being a problem because, again, they're either incredibly stupid or they're just able to instantly spot you and take you out with tons of very accurate rifle fire. Now, the way they tried to get around that is by making the stealth a bit more forgiving. You see, when you make a shot and it's not masked by sound, then you are given a last known position marker and it tells you to relocate. If you relocate, then you remain a ghost effectively. But if you don't relocate and you take another shot in that spot, then they'll spot you and you'll have to relocate. Otherwise, you're just going to have a bunch of dudes descending on your position and trying to mow you down. The thing is that they made it incredibly easy to relocate because once you're a certain distance away, it becomes rather difficult for the AI to spot you, and thus you end up effectively exploiting the AI at the developer's request, which is a bit odd. It's like they knew the AI was a problem from V2 and they knew there was a problem still in Sniper Elite 3, so they decided to just make the game more forgiving overall, and thus it ends up kind of negating the problem, but not really. It's more of a stopgap measure than an actual solution, and if they're going to take this series forward, then they definitely need to make some serious improvements to the AI. Now, the other changes that were made are somewhat of a mixed bag. There's a loadout system that allows you to customize whatever your equipment is before you go into a mission, which is definitely a very nice thing, but you have to unlock everything by getting experience ranks. Luckily, you earn experience ranks rather quickly just by playing the game and doing rather well in it, because because you get experience points by doing just about anything in the actual game, and you get extra points for getting particularly nice kills, for example. There are also optional objectives that will pop up as you go through the levels that will require you to do things like gather intel or take out a certain target or any number of things like that will grant you a considerable experience point boost as well. And while that ranking system does make the equipment progression feel incredibly contrived, what you end up finding is that it really doesn't affect the game as much as you might think. This is because all of the equipment has its own ups and downs. Some of it's better in certain situations than others, some of it is just up to personal preference, really. Do you want a rifle that has a flatter trajectory? Then you'll want something that has higher muzzle velocity. Do you want something that puts out more damage? Then it might have a higher scope wobble or a higher recoil or a number of things like that. And you are able to customize these rifles to some degree by switching out the scopes and barrels and actions and such like that, but you have to actually find those weapon parts scattered throughout the levels by looting them off of corpses. And they're fairly slight differences that each particular part gives, so it's really just a matter of personal preference as to what you want out of those particular rifles and just kind of working around their limitations. And you're probably barely going to use the secondary weapon, which is a submachine gun or the Panzerschreck, because the Panzerschreck is pretty hard to actually get some reliable hits with without the enemy spotting you and taking you out before you're able to hit a second shot. And the submachine guns are all incredibly inaccurate and basically are only useful if you shove them down an enemy's throat. What you are going to rely more on is the well rod, which is a suppressed pistol that will get an instant kill if you get a headshot with it. Why are you going to rely on that? Because it is the only suppressed weapon in the entire game, which means it's the only weapon that you can use from a distance and still be stealthy with. Now in multiplayer you might make more use of the other pistols in the game, but it's going to be pretty much exclusively the well rod in the single player unless you just really don't want to be stealthy at all. Now you can do that, it just makes the game a lot more difficult and kind of defeats the point entirely. You're really supposed to sneak into a position, lay a bunch of traps along the way, make something a very advantageous position to be able to snipe your particular target, and move on to the next point, and so on and so forth. You're not really supposed to run in guns blazing in this thing. And if you do and you end up failing miserably, then that's entirely on you. Sniping's really all about patience, which you should understand if you are actually trying to use the rifles effectively in this thing, because they are subject to wind as well as elevation, and of course the muzzle velocity, which is going to determine how flat of a trajectory it's going to be. It's not going to be a completely flat trajectory no matter what you do. You are going to have to compensate for your shots, but a higher muzzle velocity does help mitigate that somewhat. And what you'll find is that as you go through the game, you find that your aim gets a lot better. You learn to compensate a lot better, and sometimes you don't even really need the focus mode where it puts things into slow motion and it gives you that red diamond that you keep seeing in order to denote where the actual shot's gonna go. In fact, on the higher difficulty than what you're seeing here, which is the Sniper Elite difficulty, the red diamond actually doesn't show up when you go into the focus mode. So if you want more realistic ballistics, then you obviously crank up the difficulty as high as it goes and you end up getting that. And that really is the best part of the game, the actual sniping itself. Because the stealth is pretty janky, and when you get to multiplayer, the modes themselves are generally pretty uninspired. Stuff like capture the flag, deathmatch, team deathmatch, that sort of thing. And in that context, it really does fall to the sort of cat and mouse gameplay of being snipers going up against each other. Which is kind of cool for a while until you find the guys who are all rank 50, who know all the best spots on the maps, and just camp them to oblivion. Because unless you're going up against those guys, you're going to find that pretty much everybody tries to run around the map and find the best sniping spot, and then you have to constantly be peeking out and seeing, oh hey, there's that guy, I'm going to pick him off, or I'm going to spot him and the rest of my team's going to be able to take him out. It's a fairly compelling style of gameplay, at least until you get to that point where everyone's just camping up the wazoo, in which case it just becomes incredibly boring. Luckily, the real meat of the game is in the single player and to some degree the co-op as well. It lets you play through the missions with a buddy, and obviously Co-op is always a nice feature, it's just that it's kind of an afterthought in this particular game. But other than that, you've got a reasonably solid stealth action game here that does improve to some degree on its predecessor, but also still suffers from a bunch of glaring faults that weren't corrected from the previous game or that were introduced in this one, like some pretty annoying graphics glitches that continue to pop up. Lots of weird clipping issues or glitches where you'll be able to see through rocks into the skybox, or you'll see ragdolls glitch out. Just stuff that's not really game breaking, but it is definitely annoying at times. And ultimately, that all makes this a rather mixed bag. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, it's just that it's not a particularly good one either. While I was willing to forgive the mistakes of V2, when you get to Sniper Elite 3 and it's still making several of those same mistakes despite improving on others, you find that it's a lot more difficult to just ignore those problems or forgive it of those problems, because they should have known better by that point. And ultimately, I give this a 3 out of 5 for that very reason. Again, it's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, it's just not enough of an improvement over V2 to really be able to fully recommend it unless you're a fan of the series to begin with. If you haven't played a Sniper Elite game before this one though, then this may be the one to get into because it is the most forgiving of the 3 so far. But for everyone else, you can wait for a sale on it. Thanks for watching.